episode of Shorr Solutions, the podcast. I am your co-host, Mara Shorr, partner in Shorr Solutions, and this gentleman with me is your other co-host. Yes, Jay, we've officially upgraded you to co-host. So Jay Shorr, who is not just the founder of Shorr Solutions, not just my business partner, but he's also my dad. So say hey there, Pops. So you guys missed it, but Jay waved. He forgets this is actually a podcast. So you need to speak up there, Jay. Come on, say
Hello,
hello.
hello. Okay, hello everybody. I was just waving on video.
With that, we are going to talk about a topic, honestly, that we are getting a lot of questions about right now. So truly, there's things that we're seeing again and again when practices are coming to us. People are now ready to open the location that they have been dreaming about for years. It could be they've been dreaming about it for a decade. They could have been dreaming about this since they were 5 years old. So they are ready to open up their location. And therefore, they're doing one of two things. They're either looking to buy an existing practice or they are starting a practice from scratch. So, we're going to talk about the top mistakes that we see providers make when opening up a practice. So, Jay, what would you say as we're looking at the number one mistake? And this isn't necessarily order of importance, but the first mistake that I see again and again is that practices don't have a checklist in place and they don't have a timeline of when they want to do things and when they want to open up their practices. So, when we talk to our practices about a checklist and a timeline, let's talk about the types of things that they need to include.
They come to us and they don't have a plan, and they have a thought, and the thought has to develop into a plan because the thought is something that I call a quote unquote hey Mar moment. And for those out
Let's tell
there,
our listeners where that phrase comes
and
from.
for those of you who want to know what is a hey Mar moment, my daughter's name is Mara, as you may have heard. And I try to monetize most of everything that I do in business. And when I come up with another idea, it's like, hey, Mar. And she goes, oh, boy, here we go again. However, that's a thought. Yet I didn't have a plan to my thought because once I get confirmation from the hey, Mar, then we put a plan into place because 90% of the hey, Mar moments never go anywhere. It's a good idea, but so my thing to everybody is when you have that thought, you want to open up, it looks easy on the one side, but there are so many challenges and opportunities on the other side that if you don't have the plan, then you're not going to be able to reach your goal. All right. It's like MapQuest, it's like Google Maps. It's like you have to have a plan how to get to somewhere. Even though you want to get there, you just don't know what road to take. And that is where most people fail. All right. Or they don't succeed. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, the
but
things that you need, go ahead,
but
Mark.
the map, Jay, just like you said, that they need a map. The map is the checklist and the timeline. I mean, they don't, just like you said, that is the practice equivalent of a map, right?
It absolutely is. And those things are, what is your timeline? What do you want to do? When do you want to get it done? And how are you going to get there? So you need three major components. You need an operational plan, you need an administrative plan, and most importantly, you need a financial plan because you can have all the points in place, people and machinery, but if you don't have the money to support everything, you can't buy anything. You can't rent a place or buy a place. You can't get capital equipment. You need a year's out of operating expenses and staffing, and you haven't even opened up your doors yet.
This is Jay, that's the flow of this is absolutely perfect because when we talk about mistake number one, not having that checklist and that timeline for all of those things that you'll have to buy, the supplies and equipment, biomedical hazardous waste, disposables, consumables, HR, EMR. I mean, all the R's, right? The insurance, staffing, all of that. So we need those checklists and timelines. But in order to get all of that, mistake number two that we see is not understanding your financials. And it's not just your own financials as the buyer, but you know this better than anybody else. Jay, is for anybody that doesn't know, if you haven't caught this already, the joke with anybody that knows Jay is that Jay's foreign language is numbers and he is fluent. So it takes Jay longer to explain to me how he came up with a number in his head than it does for him to actually calculate it. And so it's a brilliant thing. But so Jay works with all of our clients on the financial side. Anything that has a dollar sign, anything that has a number to it, that's Jay's domain. And quite honestly, the amount of P&Ls you have evaluated for the seller, not just a buyer of a practice, but that you've evaluated for the seller, where you've had to send those P&Ls back to the accountant sometimes three times because they weren't clean, they weren't clear, expenses were miscategorized. We had things that you would look at a seller's P&L and say, there is absolutely no way that we can explain to a buyer why you spent this much on a vehicle. We just can't justify it. So I think that it's not just understanding. Jay, can you explain a little bit of the difference? Because some of our listeners, when they open a practice, they're going to open it from scratch, and some of them are going to be purchasing somebody else's practice. So can you explain what financials do they need to understand for their own on their own side as far as applying for a loan from a bank, for instance? And what do they need to have in order there? And on the flip side, what are some of the things that they need to look out for the seller's financial statements that may be a little bit, I don't want to say shady, but may not quite be categorized right, we'll say.
And this podcast is less than an hour. Is that what you're saying?
Less than 3
You're
days.
going to ask me 40 years worth of questions and you want me to get this done in an hour. All right. Well, good question. There are two components where we help practices. The first one is when we represent a seller, but we're going to put this into the buyer's perspective. All right. Because when we represent a seller, I'm going to go back a little bit and I analyze the P&Ls and the tax returns. I analyze them to a point that I look at them as if we were representing the buyer. Because if they have a J, if the buyer has a J and Mara representing them, they're going to ask some very pointed questions as a buyer because they're buying something that they need to ensure that the financials make sense. So when we get P&Ls and we get tax returns, look, I don't want to say people cook their books. However, they may intentionally miscategorize something to the fullest extent of the legal limit. And that's all well and good until it goes time to get value for your business because you've taken all these deductions and expenses. And then when it comes time to sell, we've got to back those expenses out because it looks like there's a lot of owner's compensation, whether it was from distribution, whether it was for life insurance, whether it was for spouse, whether it was for children, as Mara mentioned, whether it was for your children, whether it was tickets to the arena or the stadium that are really not part of the business, but you categorize it as marketing. So when I look at something, understand we just went through this last weekend with a buyer and a seller. And we had a deal in principle for a letter of intent. However, I don't believe it will go through, not because of the financials, because there is a multiple of gross and there's a multiple of earnings or the EBITDA, the earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation. And you have to understand it doesn't always marry the tax return because in one thing you may have taken depreciation. That's for taxation. However, you're still taking the expense on the P&L, but you're not taking it any longer. If you've taken a section 179, for example, and you've taken all the depreciation over 1 year, it's no longer being able to be depreciated in subsequent years, but you have to show on your P&Ls where that money went. You have monies in, monies out. So at least I want to know. So now when I analyze that same identical P&L from the buyer's perspective, I want to know, are we buying a good deal? Are we buying the practice as a stock sale, meaning all the assets and the liabilities, or are we buying it as an asset purchase agreement, meaning goodwill, patient base, capital equipment?
And Jay, can you explain? We've seen a couple different things happen. So when you are looking to buy a practice, but for example, you do want certain pieces of equipment, i.e., certain laser hair removal technology, an RF device. It could be a microneedling device. If it's a surgical practice, you're looking for other things like that. We could be looking at, and it could go on and on, but where does, for example, if somebody says, well, but their exam tables and chairs have been around for forever and ever and ever, if they say, yes, but you should see that reception area, waiting room, furniture, it is so incredibly old. It's not my style. I don't want that. But then the buyer goes in and says, it comes with it. It's beautiful. How could you not want it? So how do they then handle if there's, for example, a situation like that where it could be over the equipment that's being used for the procedures, but it could be over other things in the office.
All right, so now you've got two different things to discuss.
Mhm.
One is furniture and tenant improvement build out, and the other is actual tangible equipment. One, understand if you're going to buy a practice, even asset purchase agreement, understand, is the property owned? Does the property have an additional contract that you're buying the property with it, or is it a leased property? So you need to be careful. If I'm coming in to buy the practice, what is the balance of the lease? Because if the balance of the lease, if I'm buying out the balance of the lease, does the landlord agree to allow me to do it, either as a sublessor or to transfer the lease? That's number one.
And this
If
is honestly, this is a whole other mistake that we were going to touch on anyway. So this is actually a perfect flow, because the mistake being not knowing how to handle the facilities and the maintenance activities that go along with opening of your practice.
all right,
So
so the second part of that, though, Mara,
yes.
is very important, because if you're at the termination of your lease and you love the business and you love the equipment, the things that physically can be taken off of a wall, like a picture, or a laser or a piece of equipment that can be wheeled out of the wheeled out of the operating room, versus tenant and improvement that you put hundreds of thousands of dollars in that you cannot take out, then the tenant improvement bill that has no value. And I mean no value unless you're going to stay there. Now, furniture is a buyer's choice. I've had practices that loved their furniture. It's the old Greek architecture. The seller loved it. The new buyer said, it's beyond me. It's the old type of furniture. I don't want it. It's not modern. Even I, when it came time to sell our former practice, I was in love with what it was, never realizing it was state of the art when we did it, but it was no longer state of the art when it came time to sell it. It was really aesthetically outdated, very clean, painted, but the color choice and tile choice, it was of the early part of the century. I hate to say that. All right. But then in 2012, it still had the appeal of 2000. All
Right.
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 So you have to be very careful, because what the buyer, I hate to always say to a buyer, you have an ugly baby, because nobody wants to hear that. The other thing is about capital equipment, where somebody thinks that the value of the equipment is worth what they paid for it. And that is a misnomer, because the value of your capital equipment is what it's selling for on eBay.
One of the other things, and one of the other, we'll say mistakes, opportunities for improvement, whatever we want to call them, right? That we see again and again, Jay, are improper design layout for proper workflow, storage, patient flow, patient and staff safety. And I think that we're seeing, there were a lot of things that we were seeing before COVID anyway. And then now there's all sorts of different things that we have to think about during the COVID era. And so, and I don't know what we're going to talk about after COVID, but as long as we're still looking at following CDC regulations and guidelines and all of these things, and they are what they are right now. So, we always recommend to our practices have somebody other than just the architect that designed your layout walk through and look at it as if you were actually going to be treating patients in there. So we have seen some mistakes that honestly an architect wouldn't have thought of. So you don't necessarily want the restroom to be right next to a treatment room so that you hear toilets flushing while you're trying to sell a $10,000 procedure and you just hear toilets flushing. We need to think about the electricity, so and what all of the voltage goes into the rooms, because you need to make sure that that room you thought you were going to operate a particular piece of equipment out of, you're actually able to do that, and you're not just stuck with a standard plug. And we also say, Jay, that you don't want to have the kitchen area, the break room area, directly next to a treatment room, because your your patients don't want to hear the staff's chatter and gossip and things like that. They're talking about what they did last night and all of these things. That's perfectly okay. But what are what are some of the biggest changes and transitions that you would say people need to keep an eye out for in the past year, as far as whether it's been inspection issues that you've seen or design flow issues that you've seen related to COVID or not related to COVID?
Well, first of all, I think going forward, if you're going to build a room from first generation space versus second generation space that you are buying from or renting from a landlord that may have previously had a doctor in it or whatever. But I think going forward, this is Jay's personal opinion number one. I think you need to design your office as if there will be another pandemic. All right. For
Let's
personal
elaborate
safety,
on that.
all right, personal safety measures, reverse airflow, have it where there are plexiglass in between people, have it where maybe there's plexiglass. It may not aesthetically be pleasing as much, but there may be regulatory issues coming down the pike in the future, and you want to be prepared for it because had you asked me this 3, 5 years ago, I would have said absolutely not. All
Or
right.
even 2 years ago, even a year and a half ago.
Now, in an operating room, reverse airflow is totally different. All right, because you're going to design your operating room that way. But there are different ways to design your practice, whether it's going to be for a surgical practice or a non-surgical practice. That's number one. I think you need to design it even in your reception area where there could potentially be social distancing because in the future, I am almost going to venture to say that people are going to want to come in and they're going to have masks. They may not sit right next to one another like they used to. So maybe redesign your reception area. I mean, I had 20 some seats in my reception area and you were sitting 6 to 12 inches from the person next to you. Sometimes you may have even shared the same armrest. All right. I
Which
mean, this is
sounds
going,
disgusting now. But I mean, it wouldn't have even a year and a half ago, right? So pre-pandemic, that wouldn't have, but now you go, ooh.
yeah. And you really have to think about things like that. Even the water fountain, in your office, there are no more water fountains anywhere where water comes out of the fountain into your mouth. Everything must be individual cups. All right. Now, I know the fountains where you push the button and the water comes out or bottled water. Now, we're getting away from the design, but there are professionals out there that do just that. They design offices. If you're going to do it right, get a professional who designs medical offices. All right. Because this is a whole different world today, and it's going to change from yesterday till today until tomorrow. But you need to have a budget. So when you're negotiating your space, this is one of the mistakes people make. They do it on their own. They don't get proper negotiation on your rent or your lease with tenant improvement build out with CAM. CAM is common area maintenance.
And Jay, can you real quick just give a just quick summary? Tenant improvement build out includes what?
It could include anything, and if it's first generation space, it can include the build out that you're doing, and the shelving, and the flooring, and the type of the doors, and the types of locks you have on the doors, and the what window goes where, and they'll give you X. And I'm not going to give you a number because it really depends on where you are, but it's X amount of dollars per square foot, all right, of the premise that you're renting. Now, naturally, the longer term lease you go, the higher dollar per square foot you're going to get because the landlord is going to get more rent out of you over a period of 5 years and 10 years versus three.
No, when you say it for a quick second, though, when you're talking about the length of the lease, so it's not like a normal, quote unquote, normal, but like a residential lease where you're looking at 12 months. You put all of this money in there. You're not looking at living or working someplace rather for 12 months. But what what amount of a lease is either too short that you would recommend a client and say that's too short of a lease, that makes no sense, versus that is a preposterously long lease? What would you recommend?
If you're starting out, well, 3 years is a minimum. Many times, depending upon where you're at, if it's open space, the landlord might be really happy to get somebody in there to rent it, especially during the pandemic. But afterwards, 5 years is a good lease. The reason for that is when you go into a space, you have to think before you even go into the space, where are you going to be in 3 to 5 years? Because you may only go into a 1,500 square foot, 2,000 square foot that has 3 exam rooms, 4 exam rooms, a mini office, maybe you're not going to have a conference room of 1,500 square feet, maybe a little break room, whatever, which includes, unless you have common area. But you have to understand, will you outgrow that space? And if you outgrow that space, I want you to understand that everything you put into that space, the design, the textures, the walls, the flooring, whatever you cannot take with you, cabinetry, all right, you're going to leave.
Exactly. Yeah, you're not, ripping up your hardwood floors and then reinstalling them in the new place. That's not exactly how that works. So,
So we
right.
have clients that are going into a location that is 3 years, knowing they're out of there in 3 years. All right. Because they're going to increase their business to a point where they're going to outgrow the 1,500 to 2,000 square feet. They may start out there as a solo provider. They may bring on another provider. They can bring on a nurse practitioner, PA, esthetician, and they're going to need more space. Now, it depends on the specialty. A surgeon, plastic surgeon, isn't going to need anywhere near the amount of rooms that a dermatologist will, because a dermatologist doing functional dermatology is going to be working out of a minimum of 3 rooms at a time. All right. And they can see 2 to 3 patients every 15 minutes. Now, I know you're probably going to say, Jay, how do you justify that? That's another webinar. But have
That's a whole other thing. But one of the other things I wanted to ask you about too, Jay, was so as we're talking about build outs and whether it's first generation or second generation space. So we're talking about the build out, and well, yes, we need to look at the costs and the lease and everything that goes with it, but where and I pose this question to you because I know that there have been mistakes that you've seen. Where have you seen mistakes made when it comes to the certificate of occupancy inspection process? Because it's not, people can't just do whatever they want and expect that it will be approved. It's like building a house. I mean, there's certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. So anything, from permitting, zoning, and building and fire safety, as listeners, if you guys don't know, Jay is the safety guy. He is, I mean, literally you've heard me say this before, his old email address was please be safe. So Jay is the safety guy, but mechanical, electrical, plumbing safety, what mistakes have you seen as far as where people have tried to cut corners and it just does not work? These are not money saving tips. These are like, beware, do not do this. This will backfire.
Well, before you go in, if you're going into first generation space, you have to have an architect. And the architect is going to create the design. And you're going to need to pull permits for everything. Now, for those of you who say, I don't need to pull permits for everything, I'm not going to disagree with you. However, I would disagree with you because you don't need the permit until the permit man comes. All right. And then you're going to get shut down. So you, like Mara just said, there is fire, there is plumbing, there is mechanical, there is safety, and there's fire. All right. Now, what may have even been on second generation space, and I'm going to give you a perfect example. What may have been when the building was built, fire code may not be the same today. When I went to sell our practice, I also owned the real estate in the offices that we were practicing in.
And Jay, just can you give your disclaimer just for anybody that's new here that doesn't realize that you are not a physician? So
Yeah,
can you
I
give
am
your
not a
disclaimer?
physician. In Florida, you didn't need to be a physician to own a practice. All right. The corporate practice of medicine didn't necessarily apply in Florida, where a non-professional, professional meaning in medicine, you don't have to be an MDA, MDPA, or PLLC or a PC. You can do it under regular corporate structure, of which I was able to be a partner in one of our practices. Now, the thing that I'm trying to get at is when I went, you can own the real estate, and we owned the real estate, in all the places that we were. So therefore, that's just a businessman, and I was the landlord renting back to our medical practices. What I'm trying to get at is I then opened up another business called South Florida Medical Specialists. And now I opened that business within the real estate, but now the owner or the rentor changed. It was no longer the MDPA, the medical practice that was renting out of it because we sold the medical practice. It was now another practice. And now the city made me get all new permits in order to get a certificate of occupancy. So now you'll have to go through the plumbing, the fire, the safety, the mechanical, and all of those again. And what we noticed, or when the inspector came in, is that we did not have these generators or these power supplies in every room that if you lose power, the spotlights come on. And I said, why do I need those? They said, well, if you're in the middle of a procedure and the power goes off, you need to have lights that come on. What will you do if the power goes off? I said, I'll open up the windows, the blinds. All right. Well, naturally, you can't do that if you're operating a laser because you can't have mirrors or the glass or anything like that. But what they're afraid of is that if in the middle of a procedure and you can't see, so the lights had to come on. So we had to put and redo electrical in every one of the rooms where we're going to be doing treatments before we could get our certificate of occupancy. What I didn't realize is they were going to come in and do a new air conditioning inspection, and they were going to do all the exit lights inspections, and everyone has to have the new batteries and everything like that. It became a nightmare. So by nightmare, I just mean it costs thousands of dollars to redo something that didn't have to be because you were grandfathered in. So be very careful because then they get all the inspectors, they come in, they sign off on it, and all the permits that you're going to have to do. You may need firewalls, you may not. That's another lecture. All right. However, once you get your certificate of occupancy, then you have to go to the city. And then you got to be careful because each one of your providers has to have maybe an occupational license in that city that you were not aware of. And then be careful because then you're going to need sales and tax use licenses. if you're going to be selling products, and then you're going to have payroll, and then you're going to have Texas workforce if you're in Texas, or unemployment compensation, have a payroll provider. I mean, we're jumping ahead of ourselves, but there's a dozen things that you're going to have to do.
Jay, so what
It,
you're saying is it's really easy. This whole process is just like really, really easy, as it sounds like, right?
yeah, very easy. It's easy if you have your checklist that you first mentioned, Mara.
Mhm.
And if you have somebody that is there to help you along the way, so you can, spend time on things that you should be doing as a physician to determine what equipment and everything is that you want. We'll negotiate it for you. We'll negotiate your leases, your loans, whatever. We'll help you in creating your feasibility study, to determine your break even point. Because if you're going to go to traditional bank lending, they're always going to want a plan. What is your business plan? They want to know, how are they going to get their money back?
And some of the things that we find are that are missing when a practice goes to open. So, and these, are part of your checklist as far as both timeline and making sure that these things exist. But one of the quote unquote mistakes slash opportunities for improvement, missing pieces, parts, all of those things are just not having the operation and organizational part of the running of the medical practice down pat. So, everything from making sure all of your contracts, all of your agreements are in writing. So, your offer letters are in writing, your partnership agreement, a buy sell agreement. Jay and I even have, as father daughter, we are business partners. Of course, we're father daughter first. So, but we are business partners when it comes to Shore Solutions. We even have buy sell agreement and we have a partnership agreement, legal, notarized, all of that good stuff. So, and you want to make sure that you have this in place. You want to make sure you have a contingency plan in place as well. Let's say, oh, I don't know, there's a giant snow or ice storm or freakishly cold weather that comes and shuts things down. It's a hurricane, it's a pandemic. It could be anything along that. It could be that there is a tragedy that happens next door. Pick a thing, anything, right? So you want to think about what happens if your practice has to shut down for a day, a week, 2, 3 months, right? So what happens then? I think we're all much more aware of what that plan would be. For, at this point, everybody has run through it, but have that plan in place. Other things that we find are just not in place, job descriptions for every person that you are hiring, that you plan on hiring, and protocols for every single thing in the practice. So it is literally from how do you greet somebody how do you greet a patient, how do you use a piece of equipment, how do you enter a procedure into your EMR system, how do you run follow-ups. I mean, Jay, I know you could go on and on, especially on the OR side, but it becomes every single thing. You want to make sure you have a protocol and a procedure, how to hire somebody, how to let somebody go. There needs to be specific protocols and procedures, and we find that a lot of times those things are missed.
Let me try and explain. It goes to be so simple, but yet so difficult, because now you've found a location. We've had clients where we have found locations, and you're not going to believe this, but it literally took almost upside of a year of negotiations of lease, sometimes back and forth in three different locations, and some of them have fallen through. Assuming you found your location, now you want to do your tenant improvement build out. Because until you get the official lease, we cannot complete the business plan. Because one of the business, the most important parts of your contingency plan is presenting it to a bank is, where are you going to work out of? And the bank wants to see the actual official lease or the letter of intent with all the terms and the conditions for it. Now you're going to need, what type of a phone system are you going to have for people to answer the phone? Let's even go before the phone rings. What kind of a website are you going to have that drives the marketing to make the phone ring? And then when the phone rings, now you need staff to properly answer that phone. And where are you going to get the people? Who's going to train them? And it's an ongoing process. Hold on. And then the person walks in the door, or even before they walk in the door, after the phone rings, you need a practice management software to enter the patient into, and that's not all. Once they come in for the procedure and have the procedure, then they want to pay you. What type of a payment system do you have? How are you going to enter it to check them out? And
And
on and on and on.
and it sounds overwhelming to most people. I will say the difference is that, and the reason Jay and I can just rattle these things off is because this is what we do all day, every
Because
day.
that's what I do.
That's what he does. Jay loves that commercial. So that's, when you are looking to open up, I would say that the number one, if I could give you the number one mistake, an opportunity for improvement that we see is that people don't ask for help soon enough. And this isn't a pitch for Shorr Solutions. This is just saying if you have questions, we are here as a resource. We are doing this all the time. We've already opened up 2 practices. Well, not we, our clients. We've had 2 clients open up a location this year alone. We have several others in the works. And it is always a really exciting time. But I think it's like buying a house where it's exciting when you first get started and then once you're settled in. But the everything in between is just a lot. And that's why it's important to have somebody there to help you. So I find that having a team that's able to rattle off all of these issues that could possibly arise, all of the boxes you're going to have to check, as Jay says, that's what we do. So, Jay, you do a better
It,
voice with it than I do, though.
yeah, it is extremely, and I mean extremely overwhelming, and it doesn't need to be. There are three professionals that I say you really should have, and call this as a sales pitch or not. I'm just a coach and an advisor. You need a good accountant now to the future, because after you're opening, you need a good accountant. As you're getting this all set up to make sure that you do it right, and we haven't even touched on this, you need a good attorney, because I have opened up LLCs, PLLCs, PAs, MDPAs, whatever. That's the easy side from the corporate side, from the Department of State. However, certain states, you have to have a registered agent that is with a physical address that, for example, Texas, that is in that state. So we will not open your corporation because you need a registered agent there. It could be you or the attorney. And then determine what type of a corporation or not you want to be. Do you want to be an LLC? If you are a single member LLC, if you a PLLC, which is actually an LLC, but it's a professional limited liability company, and then that you or then you want to determine how do you want to be taxed. You want to be taxed as an LLC, it's a disregarded entity if you're a single member, which is to pass through to your income, or do you want to be a subchapter S, which legally affords you some opportunities, but then you get a K1 on your 1120S, that's your income tax from that filing, and a K1. The K1 is the income, passive income or loss that goes through to your personal 1040. Now, I know that's a lot to understand, but what really you need is the accountant, an attorney, and a consultant. Don't think you can do this yourself. You can. However, what I will promise you is that a consultant that specializes in just this will cut your time by more than 50, maybe 75%, because we'll get these things done immediately. A good consultant will. They don't have to learn as they go. It is a process of knowing how to get the job done. And you also want to make sure if you hire a consultant that they play very well in the sandbox with your attorney and your accountant, because I can't tell you how many times I'll do a shout out. We deal with one of the top healthcare law firms, Bertadato, in the country, based out of Texas. They're strictly on the healthcare side. We deal with Allison Avila, all right, in New York. Um, and we deal, and it's very easy because they'll talk to us. It's very interesting because many times attorneys will not. And accountants, make sure you have a good relationship with your accountant because unless an accountant specializes in healthcare, I promise you there are things accountants won't know about the medical practice that a good attorney or consultant will.
And everybody needs to have all of that information. So your attorney is going to need eventually some of the information that could be coming from your accountant. Your accountant, is going to supply things to you and your consultants. You look at, everybody needs to work well with others. So I would say, I know for a fact we do. Obviously, if you've listened to our podcast enough times, or simply with one or two other episodes, you know that we work very, very well with others. And again, it's not a pitch for Shore Solutions, but what I would encourage you is that if you are thinking at all about going out on your own, opening up a new practice, contact us. We always are proud to offer a free 30-minute consult where you can find out, are we the right fit to work together? So you have a better feel for who we are and what we do. But with that, if you are thinking honestly about opening up a new practice, we are here for you. Jay, in closing, what are your final thoughts? Anything that you want to give to the audience today? Just a one. I'm going to take back that plural, Jay. You get one final thought on opening up a new practice.
5 words. Know, KNOW, know what you don't know.
I love that.
You
It's
know,
true.
and I promise you, you'll don't try to tackle it. We don't do surgery. We don't perform Botox because we're not allowed. I probably could. I'm educated enough in the anatomy and physiology portion of it, but know what you don't know. Specialize. We help you do, let you do what you do best, and that's practice medicine.
So, with that, we are going to wrap up this episode of Shore Solutions, the podcast. Thank you so much for listening to both Jay and I. We always love to give you two different perspectives and have you listen in on a conversation between two partners, between a father daughter, which is where you always get that banter, but more importantly, from two consultants that have decades of experience. So, from Jay and I, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of Shore Solutions, the podcast.